This particular session is probably the most important. I'm trying to simplify a very, very complex subject and very hard for the public to understand because a lot of this is going on in research, and you're dealing with some of the smartest people on earth that have studying these particular viruses. But one of the things that I've been doing over the years is to study the complex and then try to bring it down into simple terms, because I talk to my patients every day about these subjects. And also on these subjects, the dentists don't understand them either because we had very minimal training in viruses when we were in dental school, and even I didn't know much about it. So it took me a number of years to come up to speed with viruses. And then once you understand it, you can then simplify it. But one of these viruses just recently discovered in the last 3 or 4 years might be the underlying cause that's weakening the immune system, the pre-existing conditions. And then the viruses like the common influenza virus and then the COVID-19 virus comes and just kind of nudges the patient over the cliff, and they actually die from that. So let's get going on this third session, and I hope that it's very interesting to you. As I mentioned in the first presentation, you can go back and review it, that I started publishing books in 2009 on the subject. The Stealth Killer was the first one, and that basically introduced the relationship between gum disease and Alzheimer's disease, and also Lyme disease and syphilis. So all those are related to each other. And then the other book is Chronic Disease Unfairly Targets Women, and I think it's for all women should read that book. And then The Silent Saboteurs, my co-author David Krutchkov and I collaborated on this book, and this gets into a lot more detail in the relationship between gum disease and systemic disease. And the Legalized Crime Implant Dentistry Turf Wars and Modern Chronic Disease talks about the legal problems with patients who suffer from chronic disease with multiple missing teeth, which I called multiple tooth syndrome, seem to have immune suppression and also cognitive decline. I think that's a very good book for most dentists that are implant dentists to know what they're getting into. And then To Stop Alzheimer's Disease, it basically is a short summary. So I just want to make sure you understand that purchasing these books, all of the proceeds go into further research on this subject. And here, killer viruses is rising from the ashes of COVID-19, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and many other modern chronic diseases. And this goes over mainly what I'm going to be going over in this lecture. The lecture will be a lot more detailed than, in many ways, than the book was, but this book in its print form is a little pricey because there's a lot of color photographs through it, and it discloses a lot of information that is easier to probably study than it would be to listening to a lecture. So again, all the proceeds of this go to research. First of all, I'd like to define what we call the definition of chronic disease. All chronic disease are related to beta amyloid production, which includes heart disease, diabetes, atherosclerosis, neurologic diseases such as obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, plus most other what were once referred to as autoimmune diseases. These autoimmune diseases, that term in itself is a misnomer, still used extremely frequently in modern medicine today. But the thing of it is, the definition of an autoimmune disease, the body is attacking its own cells. But this is not the case. The body is actually attacking infected cells, primarily by the viruses that we're going to be talking about today. So exactly what is beta amyloid? Well, to be honest with you, it's been a mystery in medicine for as many years as I've studied medicine. And I didn't understand it until I started diving into the study of viruses and getting deeper into the microbiology of what amyloid itself is. And then once I started understanding what amyloid and what that was made up of, it became an epiphany for me to understand what we call prion diseases, what's the human form of mad cow disease, which is a very serious issue back in England a few years ago where they had to slaughter all the cattle in the country because of this, what we now know as a virus, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and how serious the disease is. And this beta amyloid that's involved with this, as we find out now, it's involved with all the chronic diseases, especially diabetes, heart disease, and Alzheimer's disease. So let's delve into this subject, and I'd like to have beta amyloid become part of your vocabulary. So normal amyloid is a stacking of normal prions. And amyloid, we used to think that amyloid was what's plugging up the brain in Alzheimer's disease because the lesions were associated with amyloid. And pharmaceutical companies spent millions of dollars, to get drugs that would eliminate the amyloid, but in the long run, they had to give it up because they could get rid of amyloid, but it wouldn't get rid of the disease. So they lost millions of dollars over this. We now know that amyloid is actually an antimicrobial, especially antivirus. And this is very important because now we see amyloid in a lesion, it's reacting to a virus. As a matter of fact, normal prions function in the body is very important. It contributes to pigmentation. It adds to the storage of hormones. It facilitates fertilization of eggs by sperm. It has antimicrobial responses and regulates necrosis or the death of cells. And also it regulates copper in the cell, so it's extremely important. And we were taught for years that prions were bad, prion diseases. The prion diseases are bad, but we were talking about the abnormal prions, not normal prions. But normal prions are absolutely essential for life. So there's two types of prions. On your right is what's called a normal prion, and on the left is the problematic prion, or the prions that are formed when they react to viruses. And there's quite an assortment. I think there's identified 40 different prions that are what we call folded over versions of the normal ones. And I think that as it reacts to the virus, the body produces the different types of prions to fight different types of viruses. And we're going to talk about the viruses in just a few minutes and how this relates to them. Prions stack together. On your left, you see the normal prions and then the abnormal folded over version of the prions. And on the right, you see a molecule rendition of the stacking of these prions to form amyloid. So amyloid is a stacking of normal prions, and beta amyloid is a stacking of the abnormal folded over version of the prions. So the slide rendition right now is a stacking, it's called beta amyloid, and it's a stacking of the folded over versions of the prions, and that's a molecular rendition of it. Okay, the three viruses that we're going to talk about in this half-hour lecture is the Herpes Simplex virus number 1, and that's the cold sore virus. And I understand that there are a lot of other viruses that are involved with the herpes virus, such as the congenital herpes and also chickenpox and shingles, and they're all basically herpes viruses. There's several more. But the one that seems to be involved with chronic disease, because we find it prevalent in Alzheimer's disease, is the Herpes Simplex number 1. And then the SPHINX virus I've kind of highlighted in red because this one has been recently discovered, and they're all very small encapsulated heat-resistant viruses that are very hard to discover. And this one here might be the one that's related to the pre-existing conditions in chronic disease like heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and most other chronic diseases. And then the Picornavirus is another very small, only recently discovered. But that has been a contaminant in a lot of the cultures that have been used to produce vaccines and do a lot of research. And the problem with viruses and producing vaccines is that you need live cells from animal sources for the most part. And these little viruses are very hard to detect. And so they've been contaminants, and it has become a problem. So we'll discuss a little bit of that as we go on, and then let's continue on with the lecture. We'll leave the discussion of COVID-19 and start moving into several other viruses that are very important when it comes to disease. The first one is evidence concerning the herpes viruses. A very pivotal time in my research because I've been studying chronic disease for the better part of 20 years. But in somewhere around June 2010, Jorgen Slotz, he's a periodontist from USC, an extremely knowledgeable individual, and published lots of papers on periodontal disease. But at this point in his career, realized that the herpes viruses had something to do with periodontal disease. And when I heard this, it was stunning to me because up to that point, I hadn't considered viruses in my career. This information about virus was so pivotal in my career that the first thing I did is realize, number one, I didn't know much about viruses up to that point. As a dentist in dental school, we learn a little bit, but not very much. So I went out to Amazon and I tried to find the most comprehensive textbooks on biology as I could, and I picked Field's biology. And those books over the years, over a long period of time, actually I didn't look at them for several years, but when things really started gearing up toward these viruses, I can't believe how much I've learned and how much information is absolutely pivotal in understanding chronic disease, the relationship between bacteria and viruses, how they work together, and the whole process started to become much more clear. There was times that I had to put this away for as much as a year because it got so complex that my brain just wouldn't process it. And so I'd put it away and then I'd come back to it. And somehow during that time, this material sorted out in my brain and I began to understand it. Ruth Igzaki published an article in 2014, a couple years after Dr. Slotz, and she had definitively shown that the herpes complex virus number 1, which is the one that has to do with cold sore, was present in elderly brains. So now we have two findings that have something to do with periodontal disease. First is McCloskey's article, Alzheimer's disease and neural spirochetes, analysis of the evidence following Cox and Hill's criteria. And in that article, she proved 92% of Alzheimer's patients have oral spirochetes associated with it. So we have oral spirochetes, and now a large percent of these same patients also have the herpes simplex virus number 1. According to this researcher, the virus is active in lesions on the lip. And then when the immune system goes and defeats it, it retracts back under the trigeminal ganglion underneath the brain, and there it remains dormant for many years until the immune system fails or for whatever reason. And now we find that at that point of immune suppression, it finds its way into the brain, along with spirochetes and many other microbes we find there as well. So now that we have the herpes simplex number 1 associated in the brain, and we know that's associated with the Alzheimer's plaque or the beta amyloid in Alzheimer's disease, I'm beginning to wonder, because now at this time I know that beta amyloid is associated with other chronic diseases, such as atherosclerotic lesions in the heart and also the same lesions in the pancreas that seems to be causing diabetes. So I went to PubMed and I put herpes complex number 1 in diabetes and also in heart disease, and I didn't get any hits, so I don't think that the herpes virus is found in either or any of the lesions found in chronic diseases and other distant organs associated with chronic disease. So the question is, in the brain, well, which came first, the chicken and egg? And I feel like probably the inflammation from spirochetes that caused immune suppression that allowed the herpes to go wild, and probably so the chicken was the spirochetes and the egg was the herpes simplex number 1. So we're finished with the herpes, And I might ask at this point, because I'm going to ask this question each time when we get done with the viruses, why hasn't we all died from herpes? And again, I'm going to answer that question at the end. Probably about 6 or 8 months ago, I discovered this researcher, Laurel Manuelides. And I think that this research is probably the most seminal research in the 20 years that I've been studying this subject. I was so impressed with that. I actually made contact with Laura and actually had a discussion with her concerning this particular virus and its structure of it. And she actually sent me her papers, 4 or 5 papers, and some were dated as of even last year. So this is the most up-to-date material based on these viruses that we're talking about. And this one is probably, in my opinion, the most important one. And it will be a long time before the public hears about this. One's very complex and it's not well understood, but it's beginning to look like this might be the one that is causing a lot of the problems in chronic disease. In her research, Manuelides claims a virus particle of 25 to 30 nanometers in diameter that possesses a genome surrounded by a protective neurocapsid-like protein. This genome may code for the defected folded over prions that stack up to form what's called beta amyloid. This beta amyloid is the basis of Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, heart disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD, which is a human form of mad cow disease. A relationship between all these diseases and beta amyloid is absolutely the most important concept that I've gleaned out of all these years of research. And it begins to explain how the disease works and what the problems we have in the medical profession as a result of this. Manuelides, in her high version of scanning electron microscopy, showed beta amyloid in Alzheimer's disease, and it's almost a crystalline structure. And I wondered if it was an icosahedral structure, which is a 20-sided capsid that's characteristic of other viruses, which we're going to talk about later. But when I called and asked her that question, she said, well, she hadn't been studying it at that particular magnification, but I hope that she does do that and confirms that this is one of these 20-sided capsids that's similar to other viruses, bacteriophages and other viruses. But anyway, the important thing that we've gleaned from this research is the same crystalline structure is in the human version of CJD and experimental, and the human version and Alzheimer's disease. And we find that beta amyloid is also associated with atherosclerotic lesions and also the lesions in diabetes. So here's a structure of beta amyloid, which is a stacking of folded over prions. We feel that they're not totally normal, and they very well could be toxic to the nerve cells themselves. They could be causing damage, but more and more evidence coming out is that they're actually fighting viruses and they're not the cause of Alzheimer's disease. The very disturbing fact that Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, has to do with beta amyloid, which is the hallmark of that disease, and also the hallmark of diabetes and also Alzheimer's disease. And it's formed by these folded over prions, or these prions that are reacting to a virus, and it probably are these SPHINX viruses that Manuelides is describing. So it creates a very disturbing fact for us health professionals, because now we're dealing with patients with Alzheimer's disease and diabetes who also have the same type of virus that causes CJD. And as we discuss the subject, we'll find out that it causes a sterilization problem in our instruments. To do justice discussion of prions, I need to tell you the story of Guru in New Guinea. It was written by a gentleman called Rhodes, and it described Dr. Carlton Gajicek's study of this guru in New Guinea. And the story goes is that women and children were dying of this unknown disease, and they die really rapidly. And once they got sick, there was not much anybody could do with it. And they traced it to the fact that these women, because of the lack of protein, when one of their tribes people died, they take the body down to the garden and they cut the body up and cook it and eat it. They called it sweet meat. And those were the patients that were dying of guru. And through his research in many years, he found out there were what he thought were prions causing the death of these particular people over a long period of time, their research. And some of the research found virus particles involved, although that never went anywhere at that time. We now know that was virus particles. But this is where the whole notion of prions and how dangerous they are, and it causes mad cow disease, as we're going to discuss in just a little bit. And mad cow disease and guru are basically the same disease. And this is kind of a history of how prions got a bad name. So we'll continue that discussion in the origins of mad cow disease. So guru, which we just discussed, started with the Four tribe in New Guinea. And it's the first reported cases that we now know as what we call prion diseases. And I think through the researchers that went back and forth and lectured on it, somehow it got into affecting cows, whether it was a direct transmission or whether this is a similar situation that viruses like these tend to grow in the brain. But now we have a disease similar to this that had to do with slaughtering of livestock and then using the dead cows. The dead cows were dying of a disease. They had no idea what they were. And so they ground them up for protein and put it in a feed and fed it to the live or the well livestock. Well, then soon these cows started to die. And then people were becoming infected, and I think approximately 260 people died of what we call mad cow disease. But this whole odyssey went for many years before they discovered that you shouldn't eat the brains of cows, and they end up having to slaughter all the cows in Europe to be able to eliminate this disease. So this is quite an involved story in how, again, prions got a bad name. So in mad cow disease, we all, us who remember that epidemic that occurred in England, we remember pictures of cows that basically be standing and then their legs would split and they'd fall to the ground. And it was a terrible thing. And these poor cows, they had to, euthanize them because it's a terrible disease. Now we get back to Manuelides and her research and viruses and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. And what she shows, and this is a high-powered microscopy, the bars are 100 nanometers here long, and these virus particles are between 25 and 35 nanometers in diameter. And these seem to be the virus particles that the beta amyloid is trying to destroy. Manuelides in her research trying to explain what these SPHINX virus particles are, and she described them as plasmids. Well, plasmids are basically either linear or circular coding DNA. They're carried by bacteria, and we know from the research that they're carried by spirochetes. Plasmids are also carried by what we call bacteriophages or phages, and we're going to get into that more later. Bacteriophages are bacteria killing viruses carried by spirochetes. Plasmids are used to transfer DNA code as research tools. And again, all this will become clear. I'm just introducing these terms at this point, and they'll become more clear when we get into discussing the research behind these particular microbes. Now, in Manuelides' research, her paper dated 2018 concerning the SPHINX virus is that these particles have DNA sequences like those that code for bacteriophages. So the evidence leads us to a discussion of spirochetes and their tag-along plasmids and their bacteriophages and their association with modern chronic disease. And as we move along this lecture, we're going to develop the relationship between those and how spirochetes are instigators in chronic disease and that they carry these virus particles to all parts of the body. Now, when I refer to modern chronic disease or chronic disease, I'm referring to Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, most neurological diseases such as depression, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and most other what we call autoimmune diseases. This term autoimmune disease is actually a misnomer because the research is now showing that the immune system is not attacking normal cells. It's attacking cells that actually have cell deficient forms of bacteria, especially spirochetes within them, and the immune system detects these forms or their bacteria without a cell membrane. And so the immune system is actually attacking disease, but it happens to be hidden within a cell. So autoimmune disease, I don't use that term. I just use chronic disease because it's a more definitive definition of what the disease process actually is. So let's relate the number of deaths of chronic disease to that of COVID-19. The number of deaths from chronic disease in the United States would take the top 6: diabetes, cancer, chronic lower respiratory diseases, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes. The total number was 1,758,117. The total number of deaths for COVID-19 is 214. So the virus that we think caused COVID-19 is a small number compared to what the virus is. If it's the SPHINX virus, it turns out to be the SPHINX virus is behind chronic disease, that kills 1,758,117. And we know in deaths from COVID-19, most of the people that are dying are elderly people with these particular chronic diseases. So in a way, it diminishes the importance of COVID-19 specifically as a cause of death. But the actual cause of death is probably what weakened the immune system to make them vulnerable, number one, to the chronic diseases, and number two, to COVID-19. And as we go through the lecture, you'll begin to understand what actually was the reason the immune system was depressed in the first place. So there's a warning. Modern chronic diseases are beta amyloid diseases or prion disease, related to the same viruses that cause the human form of mad cow disease. They're highly contagious and they're actually heat resistant. So these diseases are a real threat for dentists and their patients. The research has warned of possible transmission of prions from dental patients with prion diseases to other patients. These articles emphasize the difficulty in sterilizing instruments contaminated by prions with currently used sterilization units. We know in mad cow disease that if a patient goes into surgery, from the research done over many years with mad cow disease patients, that even after many cycles of heat sterilization, the instrument still had enough virus to be able to replicate once they are tested for that virus later. So now we relate the mad cow disease virus to the same viruses that cause diabetes, heart disease, and chronic disease, so we may have a problem. But why didn't more people die of the human form of mad cow disease when millions of English people were exposed? And we know that when the cows were being butchered that had eaten the brains from the cows that were infected, they were infected as well. And before they died of the virus, people ate millions of pounds of this food and were exposed to that virus. So the question is, why didn't all the English people die? The concluding comments on this section about the different viruses, that it seems that the SPHINX virus is probably related to being contracted through a weak immune system, and then with a combination of viruses, and it just overwhelms the immune system and the patient succumbs to it. So the important thing to glean from this section is that we should maintain health, make sure our lifestyle and our diets are tip-top so our immune system can be tip-top to avoid getting these viruses in the first place. And then if we do have chronic diseases that we've talked about, then we can begin to reverse them if they haven't gone too far and bring us back into health.